going to continue in our series of the Beatitudes. And here we're looking at the Beatitude, which is I'm calling the attitude of justice. Now in the Gospels, we sometimes encounter Jesus' words, the sayings of Jesus, and sometimes they're considered hard sayings. They're difficult to hear. One of those is on the screen there. Right? Jesus says, if anyone wants to be my disciple, to come after him and does not hate his father or mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, he cannot be my disciple. And he talks about picking up our cross and following him. And that's one of the hard sayings of Jesus. It comes from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 14. Just one example. There are many other hard sayings of Jesus. And I consider our scripture text this morning, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Another one of those hard sayings of Jesus. Notice what Jesus says. He doesn't say, blessed are those who have peace. He doesn't say, blessed are those who prefer peace or who wish for peace or who love peace. He says, blessed are the peacemakers. Right? The word in Greek means those who are doers of peace, those who are makers of peace. Now, sometimes the sayings of Jesus, the words are hard because of the words that Jesus said, like this one. The words there are very hard. Other times, I think the sayings of Jesus are hard because of our personal, social, and cultural context. I find this beatitude challenging. Because in my narrative, in my life, I was given a narrative, a myth in my life by those around me as I was growing up, that pursuing peace was misguided at best. I was told that being a pacifist when I was in college was too utopian of an idea. Get real, Dave. I've been told that peace in this world will never be achieved because we know we live in a world where might makes right. Right? We remember as kids, we played a game called what? King of the Mountain or King of the Hill. Anyone ever play that game? I played that game, right? You get to the top and you stay there like this guy up there and you do whatever you can to keep others from on that hill. Remember when our family visited the Stremis back in the fall? You had that dirt pile outside of your house and the three boys spent the whole afternoon playing on that dirt hill. Who would ever have thought that a dirt hill could entertain a 7, 9, and 10-year-old so much? But as grown-ups, we still play King of the Mountain. But the stakes are higher, aren't they, when we play that game? And they're even higher when nation states play that game. Now, with that narrative in my head, I've often had this beatitude challenge me, and I wonder, how can we apply this beatitude in our lives? How do we apply this beatitude in our lives? In particular, not just in our personal lives, but how do we do this as citizens of God's kingdom who are also dual citizens in a kingdom of this world? Right? Do Jesus' words affect my relationship with the civil authorities in my life, with my own government, and how I interact with that government? I also find this saying difficult because we know that peacemakers often are what? Not blessed. Sometimes peacemakers end up looking down the barrel of a gun. Other times, they end up enslaved to those who exercise power and control. And we know that in this world we think that violence is a necessary evil because force must be met with force. And because we know these things, we feel awkward when we hear Jesus' words, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. But does violent force always have to be met with violent force? Perhaps we don't know as much as what we think we know. I want to tell you the story of this woman named Chenoweth. She was a professor in international relations. She was studying for her PhD, and she was taught as a political scientist to assume that the most effective tool for achieving political goals was violence because no evil dictator is ever going to give up autocratic power without a fight. Well, she was invited to an academic workshop on nonviolent civil resistance. And she attended the workshop even though she thought the ideas of nonviolent civil disobedience were Well-intentioned, she thought, but dangerously naive was her perspective going into the conference. And she spent the week at the conference, and she argued throughout the conference with others that were there. The workshop was arguing that it was best to seek civil resistance through such actions as boycotts or protests or mass non-cooperation and other methods. And the leaders of that conference cited examples like the People's Power movement in the Philippines back in the 80s or the overthrow of Slobodan Milosevic in Yugoslavia. But for her, every example that they gave, she had another example where it didn't work, such as Tiananmen Square in China. At the end of the week-long conference, she hadn't made many friends, but someone came up to her by the name of Maria Stefan came up to her. And she said, if you really believe this, why don't you find out who's right? Why don't you study it? Can you study this empirically? Which is better, nonviolent civil disobedience or violent actions to overthrow an autocratic government? And so together, Chenoweth and Stefan looked at every movement, both nonviolent and violent, from 1900 to 2006, and looked at whether they were successful in their goals or not. And their study, their empirical study, surprised Erica Chenoweth. This is what she found, that the nonviolent civil disobedience movements were more successful in achieving their goals than the violent ones. They even achieved more partial success than the violent movements. They counted a campaign as successful if the goal had been achieved within 1 year, within the peak of the event. When she had started out, Chenoweth was fairly certain that violent political campaigns would be more likely to accomplish their goals. That's what she was taught as a political scientist. But she and the conventional wisdom she discovered were wrong. Not only that, she discovered that there was a probability that a country would be a democracy and moving towards a just and peaceful society more often than not through a nonviolent campaign. That those would be more effective than those that were won through bombs and guns. Their study also realized this over time as she continued to study the issue, that the nonviolent movements have increased over time and the violent movements have decreased. And so their study confirms the word of Jesus that blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. They confirm the words of Dr. King, who said the ultimate weakness of violence is that it is a descending spiral begetting the very thing it seeks to destroy. Instead of diminishing it, it only multiplies it. Through violence, Dr. King said, you may murder the liar, but you cannot murder the lie, nor establish the truth. Through violence, you may murder the hater, but you do not murder hate. In fact, violence merely increases hate. Returning violence for violence multiplies violence, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only love can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. In the words of the Apostle Paul, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Why were nonviolent political campaigns more successful? Well, there are several interconnected answers to that, and if you want to read more, you can read the book, Why Civil Resistance Works. But whatever the reasons are, their findings should call us and invite us to question our conventional wisdom. Cause us to question the wisdom of government policies that send arms to revolutionaries who often replace the current violent and tyrannical government with another one. As citizens, as Christians in the country who has been one of the top arms exporters in the world, it should even raise more questions for us. And those of us who are followers of the person who said, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. We should be questioning this the most. And yet sometimes that doesn't seem to be the case. In a Gallup poll looking back at the war that we fought in Iraq, they looked at religious groups, and they found that of the major religious groups, Jewish individuals were more likely to look back and either oppose or to think that the war was misguided by a 3-to-1 margin, as well as black Protestants. However, non-black Protestants were not as troubled, did not think the war was a mistake. I wonder what's contributing to this reality. We could have a whole conversation about this question, couldn't we? It's a big question, and a lot to unpack. We could spend probably weeks and months discussing it. And so, of course, this sermon is but a small step. It is a small drop in the bucket. It is a conversation starter. It is a starting point. What's contributing to this reality? I can think of a few reasons. Perhaps our theology doesn't lead us to see peacemaking as fundamental in our Christian life. Perhaps we're afraid of being persecuted or misunderstood. Perhaps we misunderstand what it means to be a peacemaker or what peace is. Perhaps we've been informed by narratives that are contrary to the biblical narrative. You know, in our country, we do not have peace colleges, but we have war colleges. We have a Department of Defense, which used to be called a Department of War. We don't have a Department of Peace, although some would say that's the State Department. And so, where do we begin? Well, I'd like to suggest that in any long journey, a big journey begins with small steps, right? When I was a runner, the hardest step was always that first step to get out the door. That very first step was always the hardest step. I would like to suggest that we begin with small steps, and perhaps the first small step is to plug into God's narrative of peace. You know, the world's narrative is that peace is the absence of violence, whether it's the Pax Romana or the Pax Americana. It doesn't matter that to Caesar that the peace was fake, that it was just because Caesar had enough swords to point at citizens and slaves. Another part of the world's version of peace is that peace is just simply a slightly improved version of the world we already have. That we would just like to get rid of conflict without addressing the underlying causes. But plugging into God's narrative of peace is understanding what the word peace in the Old Testament, shalom, means, that it is wholeness, it is completeness, it is wellness. It presumes that there is justice. The Hebrew word for justice is mishpat, and that's not just about the good being rewarded and the bad being punished. It's not just about fairness to the individual, but rather it's about the health of the community. See, mishpat is justice, and that dawns when the poorest in a community are cared for. Peacemakers are ones who have an attitude of justice. Another small step we can take is to understand what peacemaking is. In his book, The Beatitudes for Today, James Howell shares the story of an email he received from a parishioner after he preached a sermon about Jesus and Jesus' apparent obsession with peacemaking, with peace. And the parishioner emailed him and he explained how boneheaded and irresponsible passivism is. Passivism. Passivism. And Howe remarked that perhaps what he saw on the computer screen was nothing more than a spelling error, but he suspected rightly that the person, like many, thought of passivism as passivism. That somehow peace suggests we do absolutely nothing, that we be passive in the face of evil. But nothing could be further from the truth. Peace is not passive, it is assertive. We don't become passive, but we become activists. Peace, like war, has to be waged. And one of the reasons it's challenging to think about that is so often we wait until war is being waged to think about peace. Peacemaking should be thought of as a preventative to war. In the Sermon on the Mount, peacemaking means loving our enemies like Jesus loved his enemies. It means acting and having concern about the well-being and the wholeness of others. Clarence Jordan writes, when Jesus proclaimed the kingdom of God on earth, he was not offering to make people more comfortable in their sins. He was calling them to a new life in the Spirit and to citizenship in his beloved community, which alone is capable of peace. Ultimately, peacemaking is what God does. God is bent on one thing: saving this world and making it into a new creation. And peacemakers are those who identify with God's plan of recreation. And that's why we are called God's children. That we actively seek to bring God's redemptive purposes to bear in all areas of our lives and society. So where do we begin this work of peace? Where do we begin the work of peace? Sister Rosemary Lynch, a longtime peace activist in Nevada, says, as long as the bombs are exploding in our hearts, we have little hope of even understanding what is going on in the world around us. And so before we can be peacemakers outwardly, peace has to begin with ourselves. And we become peaceful by listening. Listening for the movement of God. And that's what we've been seeking to do through the series on the Beatitudes. We've been seeking to become poor in spirit and have the attitude of dependence. We listen for God's movement when we mourn the problems and we practice mourn the problems and the sins of this world, and we practice the attitude of mourning. We listen for God's movement when we use our power to serve others and practice the attitude of meekness. When we hunger and thirst for righteousness and practice the attitude of integrity, we listen for God's movement. When we extend and receive mercy through the attitude of compassion, we experience God's movement. And when we devote ourselves with an attitude of single-mindedness, then we not only see God, but we also hear God. When we practice these attitudes, we end up having the attitude that was found in Jesus Christ. Let each of us look not to our own interests, but also to the interests of others. May the same mind that was in Christ Jesus also be in us, who, though he was in the form of God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but became made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a human, took on the nature of a servant. He became obedient to death, even death on a cross. See, until we become peaceful and deal with this issue of power, we will not be peacemakers. The issue of peace is related to the issue of power. And the reason we need to work for peace in our world is because people abuse power and hurt and hold down other people. And that issue's been going on from the beginning, the very beginning. In the story of the garden, what was the temptation that the serpent offered Adam and Eve? They were together. It was both of them. And the temptation was what? If you eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you will become what? You will become like God. It was a temptation to power. Adam and Eve grasped for that power, and we've been grasping for it ever since. The snake lied and said, be a power broker and you will be like God. But the king promised us, the king of God, promised us, be a peacemaker and you'll be called a child of God. And so we want to become peaceful in our own lives. And then next, in the network of our relationships with family, friends, and neighbors. And we do that by sowing seeds of peace. James 3:18 says, peacemakers who sow in peace raise a harvest of righteousness. If you are a gardener, I'm a gardener, you understand the power of a seed. And every spring, we plant tiny seeds in the ground. And those seeds, the tiniest seeds, small as a freckle, without much mass, somehow they push against the soil and everything else, and somehow they grow into this plant, and they blossom, and they produce a flower, and they produce a fruit. We know not to underestimate the power of a seed. The same is true when it comes to peace. So think about the people in your world, faces of people who are important to you. Maybe it's a partner, your best friend, your kids, a neighbor, an employee, a boss, your grandchildren, coworkers. What are they going through? Do they need peace? Are they being pushed and shoved by the world? Why not sow a seed of peace in their lives in the same way we become peaceful? By listening to their stories, listening to what's going on in their lives. It is a wonderful gift that we can give to others to listen. Walk in their shoes for a mile or two. Let them know that you have heard them. Practice active listening. And only then, after then, share any perspective that you may have. Sometimes it will be an opportunity to add your own thoughts to their perspective. Other times it may be an opportunity to respond in confession and grace and love. And at other times you may be asked to sow another seed of peace, to give someone a compliment, to provide a meal for a neighbor or a fellow church member, to encourage a retail worker. I'll never forget when I was in college, I went to a small Christian liberal arts school called Messiah College. And one of the things that I always marveled at was the excellence with which the cleaning staff kept the buildings clean. And in fact, one summer I joined the cleaning staff during the summers of conferences. And my supervisor said, Dave, if you don't do the job right the first time, there's always enough time to do the job right a second time. But I remember one day I was walking through as like a 20-year-old kid, and I saw a cleaning person, and I just went up to him and I said, I want to thank you for how well you do your job. And she started to get tears in her eyes. I don't know, because probably it was unusual for a 20-something college student to thank you for the clean restrooms. But I really appreciated it. It stood out to me. It made a difference. But sometimes that's all it takes is a word to sow a peace through your network of relationships. Once we find peace within ourselves by repenting of the temptation to power that the adversary, the devil, offers us. Once we practice peace in our network of relationships, then we're ready to practice peace in our society, in our world. As I mentioned, we who are gardeners know the power of a seed. I discovered this year when I attempted to plant my tomato seeds from seed, which I do every year. I often use seed that's been a year or two old. It's a year or two older, because I've never had a problem doing that until this year. I always keep them in a nice, cool, dark environment, also known as my refrigerator, from year to year. And this year when I planted them, this is what they still look like. Months after I planted them, I've given up. I just haven't had the time to throw them out or throw them in the compost pile. But what I realized is that they lost their power to germinate. The seeds had lost their power to germinate. They had grown old. They had grown stale. They had lost their connection to their power source. And so when they attempted to push up and grow, they were stilted. Likewise, being a peacemaker cannot be done alone. It's done together. And just as generals study how to wage war, children of God must study how to wage peace in the world. And there's an organization within Baptist church life called the Baptist Peace Fellowship of North America, Baptistas por la Paz. Each year they hold an annual conference, affectionately called Peace Camp by those who attend. And one of the results of the COVID-19 pandemic last year was that they held their conference virtually, and they will be doing so again this year. From July 20th to August 28th, they will be hosting a virtual workshops and panels and social times and other events for participants of all ages. And the 40 days will culminate with an international virtual conference on August 28th. Like I imagine yourselves, I'm on a journey of learning what it means to be a peacemaker, to experience peace within my own life, within my own heart, renewed peace on a day-by-day basis. Sometimes it's trial and error, isn't it? Second, I'm learning how to be peaceful in my interpersonal relationships. And then third, I seek to discern how can I be peaceful within our society. I hope some of you will choose to join in attending the International Virtual Conference with me on August 28th, and maybe some of the workshops leading up to it. More information can be found on their website, bpfna.org. And I hope you will respond to the sermon, a sermon that I see as a beginning and not an end. I hope that we'll join together and study the ways of peace instead of the ways of power and control. Because after all, we have a story to tell to the nations, a story that shall lift their hearts to the Lord, a song that shall conquer evil and shatter the spear and sword. For the darkness shall turn to dawning, and the dawning to noonday light. And Christ's great kingdom shall come to earth, the kingdom of love and light. So in response to our sermon this morning, I invite you to stand and sing one of my favorite hymns. We have a story to tell.